Tonight, Jay Dyer has come back to discuss, perhaps in more detail or more in depth, some of the topics we brought up in our discussion a few days ago. So he's kindly decided to spend more of his time with me tonight. Jay, how you doing tonight?
Great. How are you?
No, I'm very good, thank you. Jay, of course, runs the website Jay's Analysis, where it's a very eclectic and interesting website where he analyzes movies, pop culture, geopolitics, philosophy, a lot of other topics. So you go there to jaysanalysis.com, and you can read his stuff. And if you should be so inclined, he also has a tab there where you can support some of his work, which I think is worth people's support out there because it is excellent analysis. Jay, last week or at least a few days ago, we talked about the various crises, world wars of the last century, the Cold War and today's war on terror, as being sort of a manufactured crises, part of a strategy of tension concocted by, I guess, the Atlanticists or Anglo-American elite to create sort of a Hegelian dialectic in furtherance of a new world order, for lack of a better term. Could you explain that or just go deeper into that and start the conversation?
And in reference to I'm sorry, what was doing? So what was the very first point that you made in reference to what?
Oh, basically how the various conflicts, the world wars, both World War I and World War II, the ensuing Cold War that was considered a product of the Second World War, and of course the War on Terror. How these events are kind of manufactured, sort of concocted in order to manipulate the global scene to, I guess, for the bankster cabal or cartel or monopoly to I guess tighten their grip on the world.
Yeah, well, for me, I didn't learn any of that kind of stuff when I was in college doing undergrad or grad school. That was more of a project that I decided to research on my own. So what I did was just, you hear these different books bantered around in different alternative media circles. So I decided to just buy these books and read them. And that's really, I guess, what I've been doing the last 10 years. And what you come to find out is that all of it is, for the most part, pretty much spelled out, by official policy papers, by official big policy books. And so when you delve into the writings of, say, Dr. Carol Quigley or Zbigniew Brzezinski, or particularly when a lot of the meat you can find in treatments of espionage, particularly in the Cold War, and even the mainline, histories of espionage or spy biographies or those kinds of historical works are full of little nuggets that really help you put the puzzle together. So I think it's important for researchers to get a bigger perspective than just reading alternative news or alternative media or this or that conspiracy site, because you really need, in other words, the broader your perspective, the broader your grasp, the better off you are for understanding the world. So what I did was, when I was working on doing my grad work, I had a class that taught advanced research methods. So that was helpful in terms of getting a perspective on how to actually, source things and whatnot. But I think in order to understand the Cold War, it helps to understand the long history of what we might call warfare or strategic operations or psychological warfare operations, black operations, etc., which we touched on some last time. But I think it's helpful to go all the way back to somebody like Machiavelli, and certainly everyone's familiar with The Prince, but most people are not familiar with another work that Machiavelli has called Art of War. I'm sure everyone's heard of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Machiavelli takes a different approach, and historians really rate this as kind of the first text of modern warfare. Now, granted, we're not interested in our day so much in late medieval warfare, but what is interesting, or what we should take note of, are the tactics that Machiavelli discusses. And I should add as well that it's somewhat misleading when people people talk about being Machiavellian. That's a little bit misleading, because when you actually read Machiavelli, he's not he's not a person who advocates complete and total pragmatism. He's not. There's a sense in which he advocates the ends justify the means, but it's not set from the context or the perspective that most people take that quote to mean. I mean, in fact, he castigates unruly, immoral rulers at the end of the work that are given to vice. So it's not a completely, hedonistic, criminal approach. He very much is a believer in the virtues. But what he is talking about is that when it comes to the war, the spectrum of war, the theater of war, there are all kinds of tricks and tactics that are going to be used, and even if you choose not to use them, your opponents will. So we find all the way back in Art of War discussions of false flags. He doesn't use that term, but that's essentially what he's talking about. This is in book 6 of the Art of War. He talks about, sending spies into enemy camps. He talks about all kinds of dirty tricks that you can do. I won't go into them all, but there's 15 or 20 that he lists there, and he even lists possibility of utilizing religious ideas to demonize the opponent. So again, not to take a side in this issue, but just merely looking at the objective fact of utilizing religious ideas as propaganda, as Machiavelli discusses. This all comes to play in the Cold War. So I don't know if you want to get into World War II per se, but particularly when you get to the Cold War, what you have from my research, and I even dug up Paul Warburg's letters. He has letters where he writes to the Bolsheviks talking about his how he's happy that the Bolsheviks have been successful, and he hopes that the takedown of the Tsar and so forth is successful. And so you can, if you know how to research and you can look up those archives, you can find out that a lot of this stuff is not conspiratorial. It's very real. So when we look at the works of Anthony Sutton, who worked at the Hoover Institute, Sutton for a long time talked about the Western aid given to these different dictators, socialists, communists, and so forth, as well as fascists. So, for example, Henry Ford has a book, The International Jew, where he talks about the good of fascism and Nazism. And so we have bankers like I said, Warburg and others who were instrumental in supporting Bolshevism. So what happens is all these revolutionary movements, and fascism is no different. It's also very revolutionary in its ideology as well, merely differing in terms of more so the methodology of how to bring about the coming great era or the new man or whatever. I won't go into all the differences of corporatism and all that. I'm sure listeners are probably familiar with most of that. But to make a long story short, the evidence is abundant that everything from the Gorky Motor Park in the Soviet Union being funded and set up by Ford. Ford went over to do that as well. We find the train of gold that came in from New York bankers to help the Bolsheviks take down the Tsar. And so when we look at the ideology of communism, especially if you've taken or studied much history of communism itself and Marxism, when you go back to Marx was funded by a stock owner, Engels. Friedrich Engels was actually a wealthy owner of stock. He was a trader at that time, and so he was the money behind Marx's ability to just lay around all day in the library and think up these big long treatises. So it's also helpful to understand that Marxism, from Marx's perspective, is not directly opposed to capitalism. Now, it sees it as full of injustices, but what Marx says is that capitalism is a stage, an era within dialectical materialism within history, as it marches on towards the final product of the withering away of the state. So for Marx is very much a libertarian in terms of his eschatology, or his end of times view, in that he believed that the state would wither away. So what I'm getting, the reason I say all that is that even Marxism itself as an ideology is a banker creation. It's a money power creation. So what we have in the history, I think, of Europe in the last 200-300 years, especially when you look at Freemasonry, which, as we said last time, was interested in ending throne and altar. The history of Freemasonry is central to much of this revolutionary fervor. So the fire of the revolution, the fire in the minds of men, as James Billington talked about, that comes out of the French Revolution, that takes a hold. Marx sort of takes up this mantle and this same candle of the revolution. This ideology is a technique. It's a technology. So in order to understand, World War I, we have to look at things like that, as well as World War II, and then into the Cold War, when the Nazis are defeated. Fascism seems to not work out very well ultimately. So the new dialectic becomes the Soviet Union versus the United States. And there's a secret Soviet-U.S. space program this whole time, which people should look into as well. I think, which calls into question the dialectic here, in terms of what was portrayed as real. And again, I don't mean to oversimplify this, because certainly there were real conflicts. I mean, in order to have the dialectic, you have to have real fights, real battles, real espionage that really goes on. Just like we look at, take the Baltimore Ferguson situations. If we look at it on the ground, there are really people rioting, and then on the other hand, we've got this rumor, which I think is itself a Psy-Op, the Jade Helm situation. Well, that's the system's left hand in terms of Soros funding this revolution, and on the right hand you have this system preparing for mass riots with these exercises, which the exercises go on all the time. So I think the publicization of Jade Helm itself is somewhat dubious and calls into question whether or not this is something that was leaked intentionally to see what the reaction amongst the so-called patriot crowd would be. But that's a different subject. Back to the Cold War. So essentially, that's what's going on in my mind at that, like you said last time, meta level, at the level of the Bank for International Settlements, the level of people meeting at Davos, the level of people meeting at Bilderberg. They're thinking in that vein. I have a really, I think, poignant example of this. When we look at, say, I don't mean to fast forward too far, but this was just one that pops into my head. In the 90s, when we had the situation with Kosovo under the Clinton era. Well, of course, that was not Bill Clinton's idea. What happened with Kosovo was that it was very important for drug running, for drug lines and black market operations, as we discussed before. Kosovo also has mines that are called the Tepka mines. And so what happened in the 90s was the special committee group of the Bilderbergers, that is called the International Crisis Group, that was set up by, funded by Soros, and we see all the same characters there. Brzezinski's part of this group. Who else? General Wesley Clark is involved in this group. Well, the crisis group gets together and they write a paper that talks about, what's it called? I was just reading it earlier. Trepka, Making Sense of the Labyrinth. Okay, and you can find this online. And what it discusses is that the mines there with these rare earth minerals and so forth are an environmental hazard. And so what we need is the Western elite corporations to come in and save Kosovo, save this region from environmental regulations and from the evil government that's keeping its population down. So what happened was, under the cover of Doctors Without Borders, the founder of whom is also a Bilderberg member, the founder of Doctors with Borders utilized that organization to send money and weapons to the KLA. And the KLA were the Kosovo Liberation Army. By the way, pretty much anything that's named Liberation Army, Liberation Front, you can already just kind of X that out as phony. in my experience, that always turns out to be a completely duped crowd of tools for some other power. So that's what's going on here. You have this liberation army funded by the CIA, funded by the West, Bilderbergers, under the cover of humanitarian aid, NGOs, Doctors Without Borders, that is supposed to take down the existing regime so that the people can be, quote, free, and so that the very lucrative mines in that region will no longer be an environmental hazard. Call me skeptical, but I don't believe that there's any concern over environmental hazards here. I think that this is very much this was an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So even though this is kind of post Cold War, this is one little puzzle piece I was reading about today that I think gives us insight into the way this game is played. I mean, on the ground, you really have a Kosovo Liberation Army that's fighting the existing forces. You know, General Wesley Clark, you know, formerly of NATO, NATO's supreme allied commander, who now, you know, in the last 10 years has come out as this champion of being anti-war. Well, that's, I mean, come on, give me a break here. I mean, he was, yeah. When you find out what he was doing in terms of NATO, his, you know, centrist democratic perspective or persona that he puts on is kind of laughable. But yeah, I mean, again, the Bilderberg is a great example of something that has existed throughout the Cold War and has had no qualms about making deals with the so-called enemy. Another great example of this, I have an article that deals with Western support for the Maoist guerrillas. So when the West decided that Chiang Kai-shek was useless, that he was thrown under the bus, and the CIA, this is on the CIA website, by the way, sent Bill Donovan over, the founder of sort of the father of the OSS, to train all the Maoist guerrillas, okay, to fight Nazis. So the rise of international communism, you consistently find, always comes back to Western elites, the OSS, you know, British intelligence involvement, and so forth. And so the network of spies that Donovan set up throughout China that are supposed to be these, you know, horrendous communists, they're all set up by the OSS.
And Mao was Yale educated, if I'm not.
Exactly. Mao was a Yale in China.
Skull and Bones.
Exactly. And that's not by accident. Skull and Bones is just the American Eastern establishment outpost of this same Anglo-American Atlanticist establishment. You know, which again, as I know you know, but you know, it doesn't have anything to do with the people of these different nations. It's the industrial banking elites, the Milner Group, Oxford Roundtable groups, and so forth, that Quigley calls the Anglophile network. So I mean, that's his terminology, and he's writing his book, as I understand, for CIA section chiefs in the 70s, so that they can understand, why are we funding communists? You know, why is the CIA aiding communists in Albania and so forth? So that book is written to explain that for people who are, you know, working within the system. So that's some idea I think of what is going on with the Cold War. We also have in the 40s, the CFR had me, and this is on the CFR's archives too, on their site. About 3/4 of the CFR and 44, 45, I believe, wanted to merge with the Soviet Union. And so they had already projected the so-called third way that people like Alvin Toffler writes about, that was the future. That was the way we needed to go. They wanted to go. And so all attempts at reconciliation with the Soviet Union should be reached for. There was a minority that disagreed with that. I think one of the Dulleses, perhaps, maybe even James Jesus Angleton was amongst that minority, if I recall. But Alger Hiss was amongst the party that wanted to unite with the Soviet Union. So
does this factor into his being outed as a communist?
I would think so,
Yeah.
particularly from the so-called right-wing side of this with the Dulles Angleton
Yeah,
style.
it's important what you're alluding to, at least what you're trying to say, is that within this group, there are factions, and it's a human organization. So there's going to be differences and
Exactly.
fights and
Right.
squabbles, and there's going to be bloodletting and sacrificial lambs, things like that. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Absolutely. And I think that's what a lot of what we see, and then that really just adds the complexity to the matter. I mean, people talk about there being what 5, 6, 7 different factions of the CIA even today. So, and then as we said last time, sometimes the CIA doesn't like the NSA and so
yeah.
forth. But it's more so at the meta level, as you called it, which is a good way to put it, where you're really talking about the people who are meeting at Bilderberg, meeting at Davos, meeting at the BIS, and these are the movers and shakers that really seem to. And the one way you know that is because they keep popping up. I mean, it doesn't matter what you read; like you keep seeing these same types of people pop up as kind of lurking in the background, as invisible hand, Spectre type situations, Bond type stuff. So
It's almost like if you're an honest district attorney. Let's imagine there are a few, and they're investigating organized crime. He would get these pictures of these various crime bosses and have intelligence on them, or evidence that they were meeting at certain places, always popping up, and from that he would develop a conspiracy theory, right?
that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Putting stuff in a local
Yeah.
model is usually a good pedagogical tool. Because I mean, everybody understands. I think most everybody understands corruption at the local level. I mean, everybody's seen, local judges, get caught with cocaine or hookers, or the local police being busted in some scandal or something. And it's no different on the global scale. It's just that they're more prominent players. So, sometimes the local drug dealer or the local whorehouse or crack house might actually have a deal with the police. Now on the streets, the police are arresting the thugs or the hookers, and the thugs might shoot a cop, and so it appears that the war is real, right? But there are backroom deals, I guess, is essentially what's. But I mean, that should just be so obvious and common sense. But again, when we think about the Cold War, I think it's important to understand the technological buildup that would come out of it. We think about the famous military-industrial complex speech of Eisenhower and all that. Well, what he's warning about is really what comes about. I mean, that's he spelled out what was going to happen, and that was all done under the auspices of the Cold War. So I'm not meaning to support communism here, but what I'm saying is that the idea that we've got to have this space race, and we've got to have this arms buildup race to be able to withstand the mutually assured destruction and all this stuff. That's all Rand Corporation dreamed up stuff, I think, especially if you read something like Alex Abea's book on the Rand Corporation. You see that they've masterminded and engineered us in that direction. We look at somebody like Herman Kahn.
That's Soldiers of Reason, right? His book.
Exactly. Herman Kahn was the kind of the daddy of the doomsday clock idea and all this, that nuclear war is eventually going to happen. So Rand sitting around wargaming and thinking about, well, what happened if we did have a nuclear war? What's the algorithm that we could draw up to figure out if how many will survive, and can we actually take out the Soviet Union, and blah 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 blah. And these are all former Trotskyites that become the neocons. That's who are that's the brain trust, the defense intellectuals, as Gould and Fitzgerald call them, that make up Rand. So you have this, again, still revolutionary ideology that's running these entities like Rand, and I think that helps to explain why, when people look at neoconservative foreign policy or something like that, they have a hard time figuring out. I'm saying, the average public, have a hard time figuring out, well, why is it that we're continually, decade after decade, being engineered in this more liberal, quote unquote, liberal world order perspective, in the sense of, it doesn't matter whether it's Bush, Obama, it's not Bush and Obama and whoever else is going to be. It's the think tanks, the foundations that are driving the policy and the ideology to take us in a perspective where we can integrate into the quote global community. So any forms of sovereignty have to be knocked out. And by the way, I might add, in Tragedy and Hope, Quigley actually says that the idea for continental unions is not a recent plan. This is actually an old plan. And every different power bloc has used this. So the Nazis had the idea for continental union trading blocs, and that the continental union trading bloc would be a stepping stone to the global government. So, well, Nazis didn't work out, but that same ideology, that same plan, which is more of a, round table Oxford style plan, that is what's being implemented. Okay, so that's all this TPP, partnership, all that goes back, 100 years. So this is an old strategy, an old plan. And so looking at the Cold War, what that is the thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Cold War, America, thesis, Soviet Union, antithesis, third way, blending, Alvin Toffler, etc. That's the synthesis that takes us towards global government. So, and then again, ultimately, that is kind of a revolutionary Marxist strategy of, smashing things together, and then, order out of chaos, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what's going on. That is the 20th century. We're, well on our way into that. And I don't mean to ramble all day, but it's important to, I think, understand that the Cold War allowed the Silicon Valley elite, the military tech warfare elite, to utilize all of this money, all of this black budget stuff, all this black ops stuff, funnel billions of dollars, trillions over decades throughout the Cold War into all these high-tech research projects. And so that's why you have the Bohemian Grove, I think in 82, 83, proposing the Star Wars Defense Initiative. Now, the internet has already existed since the 60s, late 60s and into the 70s, DARPANET and ARPANET. And by 1991 or 2, it becomes just internet. But this is established by this same coterie that is involved in Iran-Contra. Okay, so John Poindexter was involved in establishing DARPA. He was also convicted in the Iran-Contra scandal. So what I'm getting at here is that even this of the octopus it's all the same types of players. And so when we look at DARPA, when we look at the buildup of the Star Wars Defense Initiative, which was DARPA, which was using DARPA, that allowed the emergence of what is the architecture of the coming tech surveillance grid and the Internet of Things. I mean, all of this is straight out of DARPA. So that's the whole, I think, ultimately the point of the Star Wars Defense Initiative was not ultimately because of, I mean, yeah, there's a strategic defense, protection, security aspect of it. But what you're going to see is that iPhones are in Russia. iPhones are in China. iPhones are made in China. I mean, the uniformity of the monopolistic system that we're under is itself, by its very nature, I guess, designed to be global. And so it's the technological aspect of it that's going to carry us into the global government, mainly through things like simplicity and ease. I mean, it's going to be easy to have a cashless society when you pay with your phone or with a microchip. And then that's really what I think the Cold War and the long-term strategy was about, was about ending national sovereignty, forcing nations into larger power blocks. Think of the Soviet satellite nations, Think about the U.S., and all their CIA puppet dictators and everything, forcing a global conflict, and then out of this, you coagulate, kind of like the alchemical Soviet coagulating, the alchemical um, mantra. So that's my perspective on the Cold War in brief.
You have to take this broad look, because in order to get where we are today, you needed the conflicts of the 20th century, the Cold War and the subsequent war on terror, and it wasn't just politicians responding to exigent circumstances or various unrelated emergencies, or just sort of a chain of events that were related but not really part of a plan. What you're suggesting is there's some sort of long-term plan, broadly speaking. It doesn't say there aren't turns and
Right.
things that
Exactly.
occur within those conflicts. But broadly speaking, it's being directed in that direction, and we do
Absolutely.
have evidence for that. I think I mentioned last conversation about the Reese Committee investigations of the 1950s. At the time, I think they thought they were investigating communists. As they dug deeper, it
Exactly.
was much more than communism. And I think it was Norman Dodd who hired a young lady named Catherine Casey, was her name, and she was sent up to investigate I think the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And she was very skeptical about the investigation, saying these foundations they're philanthropic, they're good, and she basically had the mainstream view of these organizations. But in the course of their investigation, I guess at the time the foundations themselves were gullible. Not They didn't take proper care to keep her out of the minutes, and she was able to go through the minutes of these meetings, and she had a nervous breakdown from what she found out. According to Norman Dodd, she couldn't handle it. She found a broad, this conspiracy, if you want to use that word, of these foundations to embroil the United States in a series of wars. And that's the only way you could transform the country and collectivize it. And collectivize is an important word because ultimately these people are collectivists, I guess. And of course, they're the ones deciding things. And that in itself, I think, gave us an idea of what was going to come in the 20th century, and it did. I mean, you had the World Wars, you had the Cold War, you had the creation of the League of Nations, the Bank of International Settlements. That system
Yeah.
collapsed. And out of World War II, we got the UN, the World Bank, the IMF,
Right.
right? And we go from there. So that's an interesting, perspective. You take that broad look, So
Yeah. It's
yeah,
it's repeating
yeah,
patterns. It's just like aiding Saddam and then taking him out, putting in the
yeah.
next guy, and then he has, like we said, an expiration date when he starts to go bad and stink like milk in the fridge. But this is exactly what Toffler's book, The Third Wave, talks about. He talks about first wave society being agrarian and so forth, and then you have an industrial revolution, the second wave, and then the supposed third wave that we're destined to enter is the super industrial society, where you have uh, the space age, the technotronic era, global village, blah 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 blah. And this is where we get into the whole green agenda and all that with the Club of Rome and Maurice Strong and these different. You know, this is a very very crucial arm of the think tank foundation leg of the octopus, arm of the octopus, because that's who created this whole green movement. So, in that article that you mentioned that I did on ISIS and feminists and thugs, I mean, we could throw in another one, which is the Greenies. The Greenies are just another one of these supposed, enlightened minorities that think that they have it all figured out, and because their professor with, the homosexual professor with the ponytail, and the T-shirt and the Marxist lingo told them that everything Western is bad, and that the only way out of all this is to accept austerity and living. I mean, I heard all this in college, so I mean, I saw it firsthand. I'm sure we've all seen this,
That came out of
but
the Club of Rome. This.
it did.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the
yeah,
yeah, and these are all the same. I mean, all of for example, I dug up Shell white papers from Shell funding the green movement. Now, I mean, I'm sure that's not surprising to you, but I think to most people caught up in these, little bitty fragmented dialectics and these little piecemeal approaches, they might think, well, why would Shell fund the green movement? Well, the green movement is central to moving towards what you're talking about, this global community, global village, the third wave, because it ultimately means that there's only the collective.
Well, why would J.P. Morgan?
Like you said, there's only the
Yeah.
global village.
Why would J.P.
Right.
Morgan fund the Bolsheviks? As that Anthony Sutton. But
Exactly.
Anthony Sutton,
Exactly.
Anthony, as you mentioned, Anthony Sutton. I want to delve a little into his research. You said he uncovered that Wall Street had supported the Bolsheviks, the Nazis, the Italian fascists, even Sun Yat-sen in China, undermining
Yes.
China. They were also with Yale and Mao's revolution. Um, his view is that funding these funding these radical groups, revolutionary groups, these wars made business sense because what they wanted to do is they wanted to create captured markets. They wanted to destabilize areas like Russia because they didn't want them to compete with the West. At the same time,
Exactly.
they could destabilize the region, then gain access to the resources and control the situation. Whereas if
Absolutely.
Russia were allowed to develop on its own, which it was up until 1914, um, it was becoming sort of a capitalist constitutional monarchy. Then it was destabilized. But
Right.
that goes back to British policy with Halford Mackinder, with the controlling Eurasia.
Absolutely.
Can you explain a little of that? Because there's a British angle here, there's a Zionist angle here. Like you said, there's a lot of factions involved in this.
There are these different factions. You're
Yeah.
right, and you've got Brzezinski representing kind of that, one of the main minds of the Cold War. So I think he's central to understanding the Atlanticist, but not necessarily Zionist wing of the spectrum, uh, where his strategy is that because Afghanistan is the gateway to Eurasia, the gateway to the east, and it's also again very much a heroin opium
It's
hotbed.
always there, isn't it?
So
The drug
exactly.
trade.
Uh,
Yeah.
right, and just like with the KLA and fighting Slobodan Milosevic, it's the same situation with Afghanistan, where you've got the uh, the Iran Contra crew, which shows that the ideologies may differ, because Brzezinski might have a different ideology with neoconservative war hawk type approaches, but regardless, it's the same crew with the BCCI that's funding the Mujahideen. That's the the neocons that are funding the Contras, right, through Iran Contra. So it's the same bank utilizing the same principles. It just might be different game plans. It's like you have a coach and an assistant coach on the team, and the assistant coach might prefer this play, but the head coach says, "Now we're going to go with this one." So I think that's kind of how it plays out on the ground in terms of policy making and strategies and so forth. But 1978 79 is a great example, because that's really um, a culmination, I guess, of 150 years of great game. And well, it wouldn't be 150; it would be late 1800s to 1978. But that's that kind of a culmination there, where the idea of funding and radicalizing Islamic jihad really is. Brzezinski steps into that role of taking the mantle of what the British strategists had done for so long prior to him. So when we understand that, then when we start thinking about the propaganda of things like, well, the evil empire and all that, that really doesn't have any meaning at this level. That's just propaganda to mobilize the masses for getting behind this or that war. So um, I don't know if that answers your question, but there is some speculation that I think is interesting. I don't know if you know who Kerry Bolton is. I don't agree with necessarily everything that Kerry Bolton says, but he does have an interesting thesis that Stalin didn't completely go according to script, and so part of the reason, again, not totality, but part of the reason for the Cold War was that Stalin was doing some things that the Atlanticists did not like. For example, the CFR meetings that I mentioned, where they were ready to offer billions in aid to the Soviet Union. Stalin apparently did not accept that aid. So, as to all the exact details of, to what degree this or that Western industrialist or banker still had their fingers, involved in building up the Soviet Union, that's still something I'm kind of trying to tease out, because this is just Cold War stuff is really just something that I've taken on as a research project in the last 4 or 5 years. So I wouldn't by any means call myself an expert, but I definitely think that the basic principles that Sutton lays down about the funding of fascist, communists, and socialists and Soviets is absolutely true. And then so from there, it's more so a matter of teasing out, who's going off script, who's making who mad, who's actually maybe trying to set up some kind of resistance. I think in the situation with Russia now, it's interesting because, Putin did kick out certain Russian mafia guys. There has been some apparent difference in terms of what's going on in Russia. So I think that's interesting in terms of where things are going, especially when we think about that the IMF was who looted Russia for hundreds of billions under Yeltsin. So once Gorbachev sort of supposedly caved into the West, in come the vultures to loot the place. And that's exactly what happened with the Ukraine when you had the coup in Kiev. Well, in comes the IMF. So here's $18 billion, sign on to everything we want. So that's the whole thing right there. I mean, it's just like with Milosevic and the KLA. What happens? Well, as soon as Milosevic goes down, in comes the IMF.
It's the economic hitman model, I guess. That's
exactly.
And you mentioned Stalin. It's interesting. Stalin didn't exactly go to script, and that's how you have to look at these things, because although we often use terms like moving the chess pieces, the pieces that are being moved aren't pieces of wood. They're human beings, and they're complex, they're dynamic, and some people have suggested or have theorized that same thing happened with Hitler, that he went off script a little bit and then they had to improvise. And that's why when you say these wars are engineered, it does not mean that everything is planned for it. Just broadly speaking, they're planned, they're executed. They need a crisis, they need a general war. Just some people also theorize that if you read Zionist literature in the early 20th century, is in order to vindicate the Zionist plan, they needed a general crisis in Europe to get the Jews out of Europe. And broadly speaking, the Zionists and the SS had the same objective, to get the Jews out of Europe. And they achieved that.
Well, and who was involved in that? Lord Balfour.
Lord Balfour, who that factored in the U.S. entry into the war, because they promised that with their influence in the United States on Wall Street, with people like Brandeis and I guess who was the guy of the economic czar at World War I. What was his name?
Economic.
Well, that's the term I'm using, but Bernard Baruch. The banker.
Okay.
And Jacob Schiff and Kuhn Loeb and these guys, right. And so they might have had a personal grudge against Russia itself because of Russia's reputation. Yeah. So there's a lot of could have been multiple motivations behind this thing, but
here's a good example I always use, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but let's say you had a local business, and let's say you were bug man and you sprayed for bugs. And in comes, let's say you have an employee who quits and he starts, the bestbugservice.com, right? So he's got the best. So what do you do? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the judge and to the city commission, and I'm going to say that the chemical that he's using is an environmental danger and that it's illegal. So I get that law passed, puts him out of business. I mean, that's really all this stuff is. And it doesn't have to be bug spray. I mean, it could be, opium.
That's great. Yeah, that's great.
We got to crack down on the drug running in Kosovo. Yeah. And so then we come in to run the drugs.
Yeah, that's how we kicked the French out of Indochina.
There you go. Right.
That was a big OSS operation, later CIA. But that's I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was just in preparation for the interview. I happened to watch an interview with Anthony Sutton and the late Stanley Monteith, and
Yes.
he says you have to look at it this way: these are businessmen, and the way you get really
Mm-hmm.
rich is you don't go into the market and compete with everybody. You monopolize, and you cozy up to the government. You take over the government and use governmental power to go in to take over markets, to capture markets, and that's what these guys are doing in Russia. William Boyce Thompson or Thomas Lamont, Jacob Schiff, these guys that showered the Bolsheviks with millions of dollars. They were also funding the White Russians at the time too, so they were hedging their bets. And so it isn't to say these guys were committed communists, and they were they were opportunists, ruthlessly so.
Yeah,
That's what it was.
exactly. At that level, they don't care about
No,
ideology.
no, yeah.
Ideology is for dummies down on the street protesting with
And that's what
Occupy
Kara Quigley
signs.
said in Hat Tragedy Hope. Yeah.
Exactly. It reminds me of the funny scene in Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield, where he goes back to college with his son, and there's this snooty, know-it-all, sort of left-leaning economics professor who's up there talking about all these facts and figures, and Rodney Dangerfield keeps interrupting, and he says, "Oh, well, I don't understand. Who's going to grease the politicians? You haven't mentioned that yet in your lecture."
That's so important, because often when you deal with political science and politics and policy, and you have these so-called the approved experts talking about this, they don't deal in the real world. They don't.
That's
They
one
don't
of my
talk
main
about
criticisms of
or they think
exactly
it's
of
incidental.
the libertarian treatment of economics, much of which I think, especially at the local level, is good and accurate. I think and especially in terms of criticisms in general, they're good. Where I take issue with most libertarian economic thinkers is in terms of shadow markets and shadow banking. They never talk about that. Now, there might be some that do, but for the most part, that's never brought up. It's never mentioned. They don't talk about, algorithmic trading scams. They don't talk about the power and importance of the black markets. Every now and then they will, if they're talking about, say, legalization or decriminalization of drugs. But you never hear them discuss these kinds of things. And so, for the most part, I don't hear that. You're never supposed to talk about, black operations or false flags and stuff like that for probably 80% of the libertarian thinkers out there. In fact, when I talked about curious aspects of the Charlie Hebdo situation, I had one of the quasi-prominent libertarian called me out as he said I was a sock puppet, fake profile. So he didn't even think I was real.
Okay.
Just because I said that there were questionable aspects to Charlie Hebdo, but I don't mean to get off topic.
Yeah, they do have.
I think you get my point, though, is that this is an overlooked arena of especially shadow banking.
Yeah, it's just they're not dealing. They deal with theoretical and policy, and I think many of them just think it's beneath their dignity, or they're afraid to be labeled. They'll lose their rather
exactly.
lowly but secure position in the totem pole, and so they don't want to bring out the
Exactly.
ugly stuff, and they want to be called a conspiracy theorist. And that's a big problem, because it's very real. But broadly speaking, I look at, like, when I'm looking at world wars, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and what we're dealing with today in its aftermath, which is the so-called broad war on terror, whatever they want to call it. It's incorporating Anthony Sutton's research, he pretty much called the Cold War a hoax. It was more or less, this was a sort of a financial and political coup. Wouldn't you call it that? Sort of a takeover process through centuries of sort of I guess, an early version of the shock doctrine. Sort of how do you achieve your objective? You just turn the world upside down and get a new order out of chaos. And they were able to pretty much secure their control, pretty much, of the world through these crises. And that's where we find ourselves today. Would that be a fair characterization of the current situation? Yeah.
Absolutely. The beginning of when there was the crisis in Egypt a few years ago, you have Kissinger saying this is Act One of a play. So that just minor destabilization at that time, we've just been seeing Act 2, 3, 4, 5 since then. Libya, etc., Ukraine. So it's all, and again, if somebody was a skeptic, you make a great point there. Tim, because if somebody was a skeptic, I would say, well, no, wait a minute. If what I'm saying is not true, then why is it the same pattern over and over? Why is it always the destabilization and then in comes the IMF? Why is that? Why, you have the destabilization, the riots, the economic collapse, tanks on the streets, people crying, throwing rocks, whatever, buildings burning, and then in comes the IMF as the savior. And I think that it's just obvious. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to figure out that this just a strategy that goes back, like I said, Machiavelli talks about doing this. He says send fake soldiers into the enemy camp to stir up dissent, to stir up division, and watch them collapse from the inside. Sit up in your parapet and watch the enemies just fight each other. So, it's not any different on the global scale. The difference is that we live in a situation of power blocks. Richard Haas of the CFR says that we live in a multipolar world, no longer in a bipolar world of the Soviet Union. I don't really think that that's necessarily true. I think that's CFR propaganda about how we've got to do more to take over the world because there are all these threats out there, North Korea and China and Russia. Most of that is theatrical, because if you look at somebody like North Korea, I think much of that is staged. Much of that news propaganda that comes out, they're fake. They're fake videos. They're fake pictures. I don't know what capabilities North Korea has, but I know that the AP photos that they show me are not of a space program. They're CIA AP photos that are laughable. So, Kim Jong-un attended all the same Swiss boarding school that embassy CIA kids attend, as I wrote about 3 or 4 years ago. So I think that is another indicator that these threats are theatrical. And so when Richard Haas talks about the multipolar world of all these threats and all these crises, that's exactly what it is. You're absolutely right. It's just global. Well, maybe not global. Now, I guess it probably is global because, the game plan of ISIS in the Middle East, the game plan of right sector fascists in Kiev, or Pussy Riot in Russia, or, Ferguson, feminists. It's all the same strategy of rile up all these different groups and just basically create disintegration and chaos, to move things forward in the dialectical process.
And again, we've been talking about sort of geopolitics and the international application of these methods. You mentioned Ferguson and Baltimore, and how if a riot can't be faked, it can be encouraged, so let's just say, and you can create the conditions because you know what the conditions are in these cities, and it's very easy if you want to stir up a problem. And it's on record. They're on record on doing that. You had Operation Chaos in the 60s and 70s, the FBI. We do know with COINTELPRO and groups like the Sinhalese Liberation Army. Yeah, they were all out of Vacaville prison, and I think one of the guys was even a former undercover cop and all that. And the same thing, you can even draw on the Manson case, and these cases have evidence of some sort of COINTELPRO operation, some sort of Psy-Ops operation. Same with that. Yeah, like I said, I mentioned I interviewed Dave McGowan recently, and the whole serial killer phenomenon might be a destabilization, sort of a way to atomize and terrorize society. And he was able to do the research and made the connections to military intelligence, which defy normal explanation. There's too much of a coincidence to believe all those connections would exist if these characters were spontaneous or developed, organically out of the corrupt culture of the United States. And however chilling it is, however whacked out it may seem to the average person simply isn't familiar with the tactics of the psychological warfare people.
Yes.
So we're going to talk about next. I think that's such a fascinating topic, and you touched on that in your ISIS article about stirring things up, how some of these events can be either faked or created, or stirred up, or go ahead. So.
Well, think about when I was a kid. I remember seeing the Iran-Contra hearings on TV, on the news, and then I remember the most prominent things from the '80s, aside from Michael Jackson or Pepsi or something like
Shut
that,
Jay off. Yeah.
would be Reagan on TV talking, and it would be things like Iran-Contra, and it would be something like AIDS. I think AIDS is a great example because if you remember all the stuff that the TV news outlets just bombarded people with, this was going to be just the end of the world. I mean, it was going to be tens of hundreds of millions dead in the next 10, 20 years. And I mean, it was just, imminent, imminent end of the world stuff. And then that didn't happen.
Oh, well.
So if you watch, there's a really interesting clip. I should put it in an article or something, but there's an interesting clip that somebody put together on YouTube of all the news clips that they could find about AIDS from the early 80s up until the early 90s. So about 10 years worth of AIDS clips. And you watch the progression of this. What you see is that it takes on the character of a PR campaign. Okay. Now let's flip over to towards the end of the 80s and into the 90s. A very similar campaign begins to ramp up with global warming. So when I was a kid in California, I remember seeing TV warnings about global warming and water, and if you flush your toilet twice, then you're sinning and all this stuff. So you watch that campaign and how it gets rebranded into climate change. And again, I'm not making a statement. I tend to think that HIV is probably something other than what they say it is, but nevertheless, the fear campaigns are the same between AIDS and global warming. It's all the same style. The video, the messages, the warnings that are given are the same, and yet all of the fantastical predictions that were given are completely inaccurate. There aren't hundreds of millions of people that have AIDS. That is just complete nonsense. The oceans have not risen to completely encapsulate Florida and the West Coast.
England still exists.
Exactly. I mean, there was an article in the Independent that I think Alan Watt pointed out. It was about 10 years old, 2003, 4, somewhere in there. It's really, really funny because the scientist, the expert, the scientist says that he is confident that by 2014 or 15, children will no longer know what snow is. Snow is a thing of the past. It's forgotten. It's like dinosaur bones. We will no longer, kids won't even know what it is when you talk about snow. Again, so I mean, it's retarded. I don't know how else to put it. I don't mean to be offensive, but it really is well, the news has put out at a fifth grade level now, so I don't guess that's surprising. But to get back to the question of the serial killers, that, as McGowan pointed out, very much a 60s, 70s, 80s phenomenon. Well, where'd they go?
Yes, he pointed that. Yeah.
This is supposed to be. This is just like AIDS and global warming, apocalypticism. Well, where are all the serial killers, right? So. Now I do read every now and then psychological publications, and I find it amusing that when they talk about, they still talk about every now and then all these serial killers that are out there. And I don't know what your views are on abortion, but it's funny to me that it's always a middle-aged white male. They never talk about the possibility of females that abort their children being psychopathic, but that's not. See, it's only white males that are psychopaths in there, and you would think that they're still, according to these psychological publications, they're still, everywhere out there, right? But as for the news presentation of the ever-present serial killer out there, we don't see that anymore, right? And as Dave pointed out, it absolutely transitioned to the mass shooter. And I have no doubt in my mind that was, a deep Psy-Op decision to take things into the next phase. So, these things kind of go in phases. So, I don't know what's next. uh, the cyber stalker killer. I'm
Yeah, yeah.
guessing maybe next, because we're seeing these movies where there's some weird movie out about people, a killer who uses Facebook or something. I forget the name. Unfriended. That's it.
The
So
Facebook killer, which is a big,
uh,
yeah.
the
And you have a
Facebook
TV show
killer,
now is
right?
about
So now we're
cyberbullying. I think it's, yeah,
there. You
yeah,
go, and that's the direction we're going to go in, and cyber terror. I think is going to be the big catch-all in the next 10 years, because I think they really are, even though the internet is their baby and it's their weaponized deployment. Uh, like you said, there are still U-turns and changes and decisions that have to be made for all sorts of different scenarios. So certainly at some point the internet will have to come to an end as it
and
is presently.
the psychological warfare angle is very interesting to me. It's the most chilling because, well, it suggests that again that we're being toyed with. And I guess if you're familiar with the Manhattan Project and what all the testing that occurred with that, and the approach that the corruption of the psychiatric associations in the 50s and 60s, under MK Ultra, and the various diseases, the Tuskegee scandal. The idea that they were in Florida, they sprayed a community with pathogens to see what the result would be. You had that, of course, that was at Ponce, the French town. They blamed it argot poisoning, and it was the
Yes,
see, yeah,
I have
LSD and
seen
all
that.
that. So
Right.
they're willing to do these things to play, to screw with people's minds. That's not, but that's not beyond them. So they do these things.
Well,
You know,
for a person, yeah, for a person who's skeptical of that, I would say all you have to do is look at the testing that was done on troops in terms of radiation. So
yeah,
I have one decently long article about the Manhattan Project, and how, in my view, that was really ultimately a broad-ranging series of projects and tests that were designed to move us towards a complete attack on the biosphere, so that there could eventually be a synthetic rewrite of the biosphere. Admittedly, that's somewhat more skeptical, but when we look at where the
yeah.
transhumanists want to go, and with the fact that the big geopolitical strategists are technocrats, they do believe, very firmly in the
The
rise of the
Luciferian,
technocratic age.
ultimately, I guess you could say. Yeah, that's what it's. Yeah,
Ultimately, yes, and so the Manhattan Project, I think, constitutes ultimately uh, a complete study and attack on the biosphere, and ultimately MK Ultra would factor into that, because MK Ultra became MK Search, and MK Search was continued on even though after it was supposed to be shut down. All they did was just rename it MK Search, and moved it to Fort Detrick. Well, Fort Detrick is where biowarfare work is done, and so what they did there was move into um, research in terms of electromagnetic stimulation, implants, etc. So the idea of body modification, and where we're going with all of this virtual reality, blah 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 blah, that has its origins in terms of Psy-Ops back to MK Search at
yes.
Fort Detrick.
Again, we're getting into an area that is more speculative, but also more fascinating and scary. But I do think there's solid ground to pursue this, because there's what we mentioned with the MK Ultra and the Manhattan Project. They have no problem with experimenting on people, and